Today we're at the AECB conference and we are learning all about retrofit.
We've got 160 people here.
So it can be a real melting pot of shared ideas, new technologies, new methodologies, help encourage each other.
Some amazing policy changes.
It's about learning. It's for people that really care and want to really decarbonise.
Morning everyone. Thanks to the AECB for inviting myself and my colleague Jonathan to speak to you all today about the journey we've been on as a practice and as individuals working with authority and affecting regulatory change to deliver low carbon buildings with particular reference to the AECB CarbonLite standard. Before we continue, just a little bit about ourselves. Jonathan and I both trained as architects. We're both certified passivhaus designers and AECB modelers and certifiers. Our practice Spring Design is a multidisciplinary practice working primarily in the housing sector for local authorities, housing associations and national and regional contractors and house builders. Almost all of our work takes place in Wales, so that provides much of the regulatory context for what we'll be presenting, but we hope you'll agree that the principles that we'll be discussing are applicable all over the UK. So, working with authority and affecting regulatory change. Where to begin? Well, to set the scene for our journey properly, it's important to start right at the beginning. And for me, as I'm sure for many of you, the beginning looked something like this. Really needed some choir of angels sound effects, but there we go. So the notion that the construction industry could make a meaningful and measurable contribution to tackling climate change, the defining challenge of our generation, as we all know, by simply designing and building better whilst focusing on the reduction of space heating demand was, as the slide shows, absolutely epiphanic to me after 20 years as a housing architect. And hopefully, from the reaction I just received, some of you will have had a similar experience. Once revealed, it all seemed so obvious, so simple to me. Reduce demand, dramatically reduce heating bills, eliminate fuel poverty, improve respiratory health, reduce carbon emissions, arrest climate change, everybody wins. At this point, I was ready to save humanity and save the planet. Of course, such a revelatory experience does have its downsides. This was me immediately after the adrenaline had worn off. The problem was, it very soon became obvious that there was a regulatory obstacle to the reduction of demand, which is, the key metric, as we all know. Because as we know, the regulatory compliance mechanism through the building regulations, the EPC rating generated by SAP, does not focus on the reduction of energy use in kilowatt hours, and it doesn't encourage the reduction of demand at all. Of course, much has been written on this subject, including the 2020 report to government illustrated in the slide on the screen, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But to suffice to say, in an industry that is culturally resistant to change, mostly reactionary, and driven by adherence to existing minimum compliance standards, it meant that there didn't seem to be any real demand for the reduction of demand. Apologies for that. But it turned out that the regulatory disconnect in Wales, and this will probably apply equally to the rest of the UK, existed not just between the objectives of the Passivhaus standard and the building regulations compliance mechanisms, but between other critical documents defining overarching national policy objectives and guidance. So let's have a look at some of them in Wales. The first one, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act on the left, 2015. Whilst it doesn't refer specifically to demand or even energy use, its stated goals focus on health and well-being and are intended to prevent persistent problems such as poverty, health inequalities and climate change. So there's a lot of synergy between these, the objectives of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and the outcomes of passivhaus design. Prosperity for All and Low Carbon Wales. This was essentially the first Welsh carbon budget. It was launched shortly after the declaration of a climate emergency by Welsh Government in April 2019. And for those who don't know, that declaration was a world first. It sets out an action plan for reduction of CO2 emissions by 80% against a 1990 baseline. And it clearly identifies the need to prioritise energy demand to do so. So that's a really important document that kind of sets an important context. Planning Policy Wales. For those working outside Wales, the primary objective of this guidance is to ensure that the planning system supports the delivery of sustainable development in Wales Again, it reiterates the need to prioritise the reduction of energy demand, and it establishes an energy hierarchy, which we'll come on to shortly. And then lastly, the independent review of affordable housing supply. Now, this is a key document that informed the technical, and this is what we'll talk about, certainly for the first part of this presentation, informed the technical compliance standards for receipt of grant finance for social housing development in Wales. Importantly, it didn't make reference to reducing demand, and in terms of performance, it focused on the consideration of whether EPCA was achievable for industry. The report concluded that this was in doubt, but nevertheless, EPCA was established as the intended compliance standard for the receipt of social housing grant in Wales as a result of this document. So, the draft compliance document, which is called Welsh Development Quality Requirements 2021, bit of a mouthful, and even the acronym WDQR21 is a bit of a mouthful. It was issued for consultation, and it contained the proposed energy standard that you see in the first paragraph on the slide. So, achieving EPCA, SAC 92 or greater, through the minimum fabric standard set at Appendix E, within the building regulations approved document Part L, Wales, and importantly, not using fossil fuel-fired boilers. So that's been in place in Wales since October 2021. Somewhat indignant at this continued regulatory disconnect in my sector of the industry, I started getting involved in what was admittedly some fairly petulant social media activity, which asked the question, why is Welsh Government publishing devolved regulatory standards that ignore its own overarching policy objectives to prioritise the reduction of energy demand? Fortunately, through a long-standing industry colleague at Welsh Government, this activity, the petulant activity, developed into a meeting and then a series of discussions with a technical standards team at Welsh Government, who were starting to acknowledge the limitations of the EPC ratings, and were actually open-minded and eager to learn of an alternative that could more directly respond to the policy objectives. It was all a bit rushed, as the document was due to be published very shortly, although that did take, in the end, about another year. And we weren't permitted to explicitly refer to Passive House or to establish compliance metrics or targets, but we were successful in getting a statement inserted that established the principle of a demand-based alternative to EPCA as an acceptable compliance route. So what's highlighted on the screen there, I think, yes, partly highlighted anyway, is what was defined in the guidance. I'll just read it out. Alternative proposals will be acceptable where it can be demonstrated by independent certification that the building's energy demand is reduced in accordance with the energy hierarchy for planning in Welsh Government's planning policy in Wales. So it obviously wasn't perfect, but we did our best. It felt like a win at the time, quite a big win. Just to give some context to that, that is the energy hierarchy for planning that was referred to in that paragraph that was inserted in the final published document. So this is the hierarchy in planning policy Wales. As you can see, reduced energy demand is established within planning policy Wales as the highest priority. So we had a problem. There was industry resistance. And the problem was that once it was published, that vague paragraph that was inserted into WDQR 21 was interpreted differently by two broad groups in the industry. The first looked at it and just passed over it. They didn't understand it. They didn't know what it meant, so they just ignored it and they defaulted to EPCA. The second group looked at it and thought, that looks like it describes Passive House. There's no way we're doing that. We did one 10 years ago. It was a nightmare, cost a fortune. A whole family died because the air tightness was too tight and they weren't allowed to open the windows. And we're not going back there. In other words, business as usual, the predictable change-resistant response. At about this time, our little cult was expanded when my colleague Jonathan, who was about to speak after me, joined us. And buoyed by John's boundless energy, together we went on a kind of Passive House roadshow. And what we did was we delivered free, in-depth, 2 to 3 hour CPD sessions to our housing association clients with the objective of debunking all the myths, like the one you just heard, you can't open windows, etc., and breaking down the basic principles and terminology. What we discovered was that resistance to the standard ran deep and included both real and perceived barriers, some of which are on the screen, with uncertainty over cost being the principal concern, but amongst others. As architects, and we were fairly new to this field, cost certainty wasn't something that we could provide the answers to, and it was becoming apparent that despite the declaration of a climate emergency in Wales, despite the policy objective to prioritise the reduction of energy demand, despite a monstrous 45% of Welsh households being in fuel poverty in 2022, there was no appetite for passive house in the social housing sector. In other words, there was no market at scale for our services as passive house designers. Despite this setback, as a direct result of our outreach work, the outreach work I've just described to industry, we had a fairly well-developed understanding of the expectations, concerns and aspirations of both our client groups in the housing sector and the regulatory body in the former Welsh Government. So we went back to the drawing board. As you can see on the screen, we were still confident that there was a Goldilocks standard that would be accepted by the sector, and our hypothesis to that effect is set out on the slide. There must be a cost-effective building physics-based design standard that demonstrably reduces energy demand, cuts emissions and lowers bills, that can be utilised to upskill our supply chains towards passive house and beyond to net zero. That's basically what we were assessing. We knew the certification was a key consideration, with client groups reluctant to appoint third-party certifiers for all sorts of reasons, cultural, additional cost, the fact that they have to make decisions earlier and appoint another consultant earlier in the process, much earlier than they've been used to. But Welsh Government were keen to have some sort of quality control process in place. So taking all these things into account, one standard was becoming a front runner, no prizes for guessing which one it was. So we went back to Welsh Government. We said, look, a year on, there's been no take-up of the passive house alternative. We've been out banging the drum to anyone and everyone that will let us to present to them. And aside from uncertainty over cost and deliverability, particularly in terms of the passive house airtightness requirement, third-party certification is also a key obstacle. So we asked, if we could demonstrate that another, perhaps less stringent standard would still significantly reduce demand by a quantifiable amount, but which allowed appropriately qualified designers to self-certify, would you consider it as an acceptable compliance option for the receipt of social housing grant funding? And fairly swiftly, with the proviso that we'd need to present appropriately compelling evidence, Welsh Government confirmed that in principle, this would be acceptable. So using PHPP, and I was just talking outside of the table of coffee, how powerful a tool PHPP can be. We modelled a number of standard social housing typologies on a project that had already received social housing grant on the basis of EPCA. And then we compared predicted performance on the same plot, same orientation, etc., between the EPCA specification and a specification designed to deliver the CarbonLite new build standard. So what you see on the screen is the summary comparison of the key metrics. And alongside other supporting output from the PHPP models, this proved to be very persuasive. And just dwelling on those key metrics, what you can see is that the CarbonLite standard was delivering a heating demand as modelled on these plots and others, because we've done countless comparative models along the same sort of line, of about half as much as the property built in or specified to the EPCA standard. The demand obviously directly correlates to heating emissions and the heating bill. And what we did was interrogated the kind of issues that Welsh Government are trying to resolve, and they are demand reduction, as we know through the overarching policy documentation, but also at a more granular level, they are talking about buzzwords like affordable warmth, i.e. fuel poverty and decarbonisation. So these are all things that really struck a chord with the team at Welsh Government when we presented this information to them. It was really compelling. So as part of our, just very quickly on this one, part of our ongoing discussions with Welsh Government, once we'd kind of had a wing and we'd had some buy-in on what I just presented, we also suggested what we considered to be an optimistic but deliverable timeline for the delivery of operational net zero homes in Wales over a 7-year period. So yes, that's quite a short period, but it was based on the fact that the end of the decade in action, the first 3 years of which nobody had done anything, is 2030. The idea being that upskilling the supply chain is simplified, and I know this won't be news to most people in the room, if we use the same metrics and approach to design and detailing, incrementally increase the compliance targets at known intervals to provide certainty for industry. And this message does seem to have resonated with Welsh Government, because we know now that Welsh Government is setting higher compliance targets for space heating demand as part of technical compliance and standardisation projects that are in the pipeline. More of which shortly from Jonathan. So, in addition to the fundamentally important presentation of evidence to Welsh Government, who else do we speak to and what do we speak about? And the image on the screen, when we showed to the guys in the office this, they all laughed and they just went, here's Jamie, here's Johnny, because I'm sure I'm sure they've heard plenty about CarbonLite in the office, and frankly, we will talk to anyone and everyone that is a stakeholder in our sector and beyond, including people that don't really want us to talk to them. We talk about all the terms and concepts that confuse or create barriers for our housing association developer and contracted clients, local government officers, civil servants, and other consultants as well, particularly MEP consultants that we work with in relation to CarbonLite, and we try to help them make sense of them, basically. We pick apart policy and industry guidance, and we focus on how the CarbonLite and other related standards directly respond to their stated objectives, so then clients and officers can make informed decisions. And this process of dispelling myths, demonstrating policy synergy, challenging in action, and translating building physics concepts into relatively plain English against relatable contexts for different recipients has really proved crucial to promoting the CarbonLite standard in Wales. So I mentioned that we've engaged with contractors as part of our outreach work, and it's really important to understand the influence that large contractor and developer, house builder organisations have in establishing and influencing the regulatory framework within which we and they work. At almost every step of the way, when speaking with both Welsh Government and local authorities, we've been asked, how much does it cost? Can the contractors and developers deliver it? And even, should we ask them first? And should we be doing this if they resist? And this is where the Goldilocks nature of the AECB CarbonLite standard really becomes clear, because once it was clearly explained, contractors we spoke to were confident that they could deliver it for the same or less than a specification designed to achieve EPC8. And with that buy-in from contractors, at that point, we knew we were going to be onto something. So we subsequently market tested that feedback with the project you see on the screen, which is a fairly standard social housing project for the local housing association in Wales, 35 houses and flats, including 3-storey blocks, as you can see in the imagery, for which 6 tendering contractors were required to return prices based on 2 specifications, one reflecting the AECB CarbonLite standard and the other EPCA. Every contractor returned prices for the CarbonLite specification that were lower than for the EPCA specification, and construction is due to commence on this project on that basis next month. So the culmination of this process has been, and I haven't really been commenting on the dots at the top, but this is the positive outcomes. We've met resistance, we've tested the market, we've developed our hypothesis, and the culmination of the process has been that over the last couple of years, housing associations, developing local authorities and contractors in Wales have started to express an appetite for delivering new homes to the AECB CarbonLite standard. What was preventing them was ambiguity over whether the standard complied with the alternative proposals option, which I showed you earlier, within the Welsh Government DQR standard, that vague statement about reducing demand. So whilst we were assuring them that the standard was indeed compliant and that funds were being released for projects such as the one I've just mentioned, the acceptance had not been formalised. But I'm pleased to confirm that at the end of last year, Welsh Government clarified its position through a circular addressing, which is what's on the screen, addressing a number of frequently asked questions in relation to technical compliance for social housing grant. And the alternative proposals are defined as set out on the slide. And as you see, they reflect the CarbonLite new build standard targets. So it talks about use of the PHPP to show the building's energy demand has been satisfactorily reduced. Suitably qualified professionals, including certified passivhaus designers, consultants, or designers, consultants with demonstrable experience in use of PHPP. And importantly, to provide PDFs of the PHPP model at each technical scrutiny stage, and there are a number of these in the process: concept planning and post-completion review, accompanied by a short compliance statement, which effectively Jonathan, my colleague, has designed. It's accepted that SAP modelling of the alternative approach may not yield an EPCA energy rating. So if we can achieve the CarbonLite standard and demonstrate that the developments are meeting the standard, a building regs compliant, because you will still need an EPCB rating to comply with your building regulations, but an EPCB rating would be acceptable under those circumstances. So we're now here. So somewhat of a turnaround from where we were around 3 years ago. For social housing in Wales, at least, a market for the design services that I suspect most people in this room can offer exists that did not exist before. As important, though, is simply that terms like space heating demand, kilowatt hours, energy use intensity, MVHR, and AECB CarbonLite standard are now an accepted part of the conversation for clients, contractors, and regulatory authorities in Wales. Well, hopefully all the things you see on the screen are next. We can, as well as our work in the new build sector, we continue to work with Welsh Government on achieving the sort of clarity for its separate retrofit requirements as has been achieved for its new build requirements. And whilst Jonathan, my colleague, represents us on the Part L Wales working group, our outreach work has directly led to commissions to assist local authorities with evidencing net zero policies for emerging local plans. So on that note, I'll hand over to Jonathan, who will continue this high-octane journey that we've been on.
Good afternoon. So, as Jamie's introduced, one answer is that we have also, courtesy of the Planning and Energy Act 2008, been working with local authorities to test policy that can require development in their area to comply with energy efficiency standards that exceed the energy requirements of building regulations. A 2015 written ministerial statement introduced uncertainty regarding application of the Act, stating the Deregulation Act, once given royal assent, would remove this discretionary power from the purview of local authorities. Fortunately, this was anticipated to coincide with the introduction of zero carbon homes policy in late 2016, which I'm sure we all remember. Subsequently, some of the more progressive local authorities, particularly following the national and local declarations of a climate emergency, started to propose and adopt this improved energy standards for buildings within their local development plans. That is, until this written ministerial statement landed on the 13th of December last year, stating any policy requiring better standards than building regulations, the worst thing you can legally build, should be rejected at examination if they do not have a well-reasoned and robustly costed rationale. Further, it mandated that useful energy demand-based metrics could not be applied, and any proposed policy would have to use SAP and express the improvement as a percentage uplift of a dwelling's TER. And just to reassure you that we're equally hamstrung across the seven, the Minister for Housing and Transport issued this letter in 2014, restricting policy improving energy performance standards to strategic sites and only where viability was unaffected, justifying this position with reference to the 2016 review of Approved Document L, which led to the adoption of the new standards in Wales in 2022, just 6 short years later, and the EU Directive for Nearly Zero Energy Buildings of 2019, which obviously stopped applying after we left. And while the picture might be bleak, we have to recognise and signpost just a few of the incredible resources available to us all in responding to this crisis, without even mentioning Passivhaus, or the AECB, LETI have published incredible guidance for retrofit and new build over the years. CIBSE, ICE, iStruct-E, LETI, REBA, RICS, UKGBC and WLCN collaborated on a suite of standardised definitions for whole-life carbon assessment to ensure consistency of meaning. RICS have published and now adopted the second edition of whole-life carbon assessment for the built environment, providing a robust professional standard for carbon calculations. And earlier this week, the pilot version of the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard was launched to clarify the targets and thresholds we must hit to remain below 1.5 degrees. There is an amazing quantity of high-quality information out there that can be used to motivate, propose and justify policy in the face of inaction by central government or central governments. And it has worked. Bath and North East Somerset adopted operational and embodied carbon targets in a local plan partial update. Cornwall have adopted the same, with some nuanced thresholds, within a climate emergency development plan document. Central Lincolnshire adopted targets within their local plan, and the Lake District have applied them via the Lake District Design Code. These are not SAP-calculated SOPs to improve relative performance. They apply energy demand-based metrics to deal in absolute thresholds. And this is just the beginning. While the 2023 written ministerial statement caused some consternation, multiple local authorities, including Essex County Council, itself formed of a dozen, are progressing operational policy positions defined by space heating demand and EUI. What was spelt out last week at the Passivhaus conference by Lewis Knight of Bioregional is that while those troublesome written ministerial statements sound limiting, they don't override the Planning and Energy Act. And as all these local development plans, emerging now on screen, demonstrate, there is clear precedent for proposing improved performance standards, providing they are appropriately evidenced. And this is where we come back in. Spring, supported by the excellent John Butler, who I've seen already, for whole-life carbon assessment, are currently assisting 2 Welsh local authorities in establishing the technical feasibility of operational net zero policy. To do this, we assessed typical housing typologies in unfavourable orientations, using social housing archetypes as our base, 3-storey apartments, a detached 4-bedroom house, and a pair of 2-bedroom semis that you see on screen. And we modelled 4 distinct operational scenarios to demonstrate how incremental improvements to specification could result in markedly increased performance. We dubbed these ADL Wales 2025, AECB CarbonLite, Bath and North East Somerset, based on their policy position, and LETI, based on the agreed space heating demand targets for each. As the energy balance graphs show, we could quickly demonstrate the potential for an 85% reduction in space heating demand. We could further demonstrate that EUI, the fundamental demand of these buildings with everything else added in, and the reduction of which is our highest priority according to the earlier referenced energy hierarchy for planning, could be reduced by almost 40%. In net zero terms, this offers a 40% reduction in the amount of photovoltaics required to balance annual consumption, offering significant lifetime cost and carbon savings. And while the necessary procedures rumble on for policy adoption, and coming back to the work introduced by Jamie, we continue to implement these strategies for housing associations and registered social landlords throughout Wales. This has created confidence within our local market that such metrics and standards are technically robust, here to stay, and perhaps most importantly, achievable. This has inspired a willing coalition of 20+ Welsh housing associations and RSLs to join the Delivering Net Zero project. This project, with funding from Welsh Government, aims to develop a pattern book of social housing archetypes that employ CarbonLite as their base performance specification. And to ensure the success of such endeavours, we also need to appropriately continue to upskill the industry. Funded education and training opportunities are becoming increasingly common. As a result of engagement with the RIBA, CoAction offer this free climate literacy course to all UK architecture students to ensure the next generation of designers are equipped for the challenges ahead. Similarly, we see regional skills centres, BEST, NMITE, Quick, secure funding to offer industry a range of academic and practical courses and allow best practice to reach all corners of the UK. Briefly bringing things back to retrofit, a topic I promise we're continuing to discuss with Welsh Government, these regional skills centres are also developing new training courses to address skills shortages and avoid stranded assets as we improve the quality of new buildings. The AECB have, of course, been instrumental in developing and delivering such content. Both myself and Jamie received our Passive House training through CarbonLite, as it was, as I'm sure many others in the room did. And I know a later session will cover these offerings in far more detail. But the thought I suppose I want to leave everyone with is that we, those in this room and beyond, passionate, knowledgeable professionals, need to recognise the opportunities to contribute to national, regional and local government discussions. It could be responding to a consultation, it could be signposting policy precedents or offering to present to officers to help them understand energy demand and how its reduction is critical to achieving our carbon reduction targets. But unless we do this, it's business as usual. Thank you.
Just a couple of questions for Jamie and Jonathan, and then we'll move on to our sponsor panel. Thank you.
So my question is, have you had one eye on what's happening in Scotland, the passive house equivalents, and if any commentary on that? Because the word passive house seems to be more obvious in the conversations happening there, and even by the politicians using the word passive house within. Are you surprised at that? Do you have any reaction to it?
Pleasantly surprised, I think. Although, as we know from the consultation and the consultation events that the Passive House Trust are running, the Scottish version of Passive House is perhaps watered down beyond meaningful recognition. So while it's great that they are still confident in using the term, ultimately it doesn't seem to be quite getting as far as it needs to. Whereas by going for, I won't say a lesser standard, by going for a more attainable standard in the first, we've got people engaging with it as presented. They're not challenging, they're not pushing back, they're just going, 1.5 air permeability, we can do that. Bit of MVHR, we can do that. It's not trying to, in the first instance, fundamentally move the dial. It's just working with people where they are and take them along on the journey.
I think, as I think both of us set out in our presentations, it's about getting the terminology, the principles, things like heat, space, heating, demand, to become a natural part of our industry and particularly the sector that we work in. And I think that's the most important thing. And the people we're working with do genuinely see that the CarbonLite standard offers a tangible and deliverable pathway to Passive House and beyond. So I think that's the important thing, that we've made the first step in Wales, and the majority of industry is on board. And cost, as we set out, was a significant factor.
Hi. Hello. I wondered if you'd had any interaction with the Westminster government, and also if you got any advice on feedback to local plan consultations, because one's coming up in Wiltshire. You mentioned the Wiltshire one on there. Swindon, we actually suggested the AECB standard for their previous thing, and I hadn't quite managed to work out what's happened to it. Thanks.
Definitely think this is one for John.
Cheers. I think there we can, in part, look to Scotland's success in terms of it being a ground-up movement. So if you can, or grassroots movement, if you can get your local councillors, your local population talking about this and generally putting it to government or responding to consultation with such items, and it does need a groundswell. It needs lots of people to be upskilled and to then be able to respond to these consultations rather than necessarily one or two voices. So it is perhaps painfully the sort of campaign that we've undertaken to get as many people on board as possible, so people understand the benefits and also understand, again, as it comes back to cost inevitably, that it doesn't need to suddenly break the bank and it doesn't need to make development unviable, but it will dramatically improve the quality of the buildings delivered.
I think just to finish off, we're a relatively small provincial practice. We're not a huge organisation. We're just very passionate, and I know everybody else in the room is. And I think that's what it's about. It's about leveraging our passion and our expertise in the room to bang the drum for CarbonLite and associated standards to get us all moving in the right direction. And without that, it will be business as usual, as John concluded. So I think that's the important point, is that we've all got a part to play in this. We can't be passive. There we go, is another pun. We can't be passive in this. So, we've all got to be active.
Right, thank you very much. That's absolutely fascinating. It just shows what can be done when you put your minds to it. As I say, thank you very much, Jamie and Jonathan.